I'll start. Ladies first, Madam Mosadiq. I'll start with Horia Mosadiq, an human rights activist from Afghanistan, who will talk about the situation of democracy and human rights in Afghanistan and the wider region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming and listening to us. And I would like to specifically thank the European Foundation for South Asian Studies for inviting me and other Afghan fellows to speak about the situation in Afghanistan. Honestly, I'm thankful to your organization for remembering Afghanistan when everyone's focusing on Ukraine, and I think at the middle of such a kind of political crisis that is happening all over the place, but particularly the misfortunate events in Ukraine, which is dominating international media and politics. Thank you for remembering Afghanistan and giving us the opportunity to speak. I'm here to speak about the human rights situation, particularly in Afghanistan. And let's remember that just less than a year ago, Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, a group that have been identified as a terrorist group by the United Nations and by the international community. And many of its senior members and leadership, they were on the United Nations sanction list and asset freeze. So, since Taliban took over last year in August 2021, hundreds of thousands of Afghans, mostly professionals and educated, were forced to flee the country, particularly women, in horror of reprisal against them. While the number of attacks against human rights defenders, women human rights defenders, journalists, and critics have been dramatically increased, and many of them were forced into confession by the Taliban simply for peacefully demonstrating or expressing their views in a very peaceful manner, and demanding their fundamental rights, particularly rights to education, rights to employment, and rights to political participation. In the past few months, the number of extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detention, and torture is at its highest, particularly against former members of the Afghan military forces who laid down their weapons and started a civilian life. Many journalists and human rights activists were tortured for covering a peaceful demonstration or inviting a Taliban critic to a TV or radio debate. Forced displacement of communities in certain areas of Afghanistan where there is a fight against Taliban is actively happening. People are forced to leave their homes, and then their homes are blown up and their lands have been confiscated by the Taliban. In the past 11 months, United Nations in Afghanistan is providing nearly $1 billion of cash to the Taliban for the humanitarian aid, and very little oversight on distribution mechanism. There are credible reports that the cash received by the Taliban is being used to pay and logistical supplies to their armed men who are involved in serious war crimes, including extrajudicial killings, torture, enforced disappearances, denying civilian population in affected areas of access to humanitarian aid who are at the brink of starvation, enforced displacement, and deliberate attacks on civilians, including women, children, and elderly, and summary execution of the war prisoners and former members of the Afghan security forces. Meanwhile, there is also a serious concern about the inaction of the international community and international aid agencies in response to the Afghans who were displaced most recently as a result of the Taliban attack in Balkhab, Andarab, and Panjshir areas. While we are also receiving disturbing daily reports of war crimes committed by the Taliban in the mentioned districts, provinces against civilians and combatants as a result of the armed conflict, which also displaced thousands of families from Balkhab district to flee to the mountains, who are also displaced to the provinces like Parwan, Takhar, Samangan, Kabul, among others. And they are at the brink of starvation. There are also credible daily reports to say that Taliban are denying access of the humanitarian aid, while many women they are dying during the childbirth, and many children are also at the brink of dying. Under the international humanitarian law, all parties to the conflict are obliged to facilitate and allow humanitarian aid to reach to the civilian population affected by the war. Meanwhile, the Fourth Geneva Convention imposes an obligation on the occupying power to ensure food and medical supplies for the population, which Taliban are in violation of these laws and conventions. Also, restrictions that Taliban impose on women is not seen anywhere in the Islamic world, even 1,400 years ago when Islam emerged. Taliban have taken the gender apartheid to another level, and Afghanistan is the only country in the world that deprives women from accessing to education and are not allowed to work outside their homes. While under the pressure from the international community, they promised to open schools for the girls in March this year, but they have failed to fulfill this promise. Crackdown on critics, civil rights protesters, members of the former government, attacks on Hazaras and Hazara-dominated areas, attack on Hindus and other ethnic and religious minorities, home-to-home search and seizure of the operation of the Taliban, terrorizing families, ransacking, vandalizing, and confiscating personal properties of the people under the name of home search operation or the new tactics of the Taliban, and continuation of their decades-long pattern of violence and reprisal against Afghans, particularly women leaders, which have only escalated in the past few months. We are also aware of the international community have been trying to pressure the Taliban through diplomatic means to pressure that they are abiding within the minimum rights of women and girls, such as education and employment, is not simply responding. In contrary, in response to the international community's flexibility and high tolerance, including providing them with podium, relief funds, financial support, international travels with private jets, and facilitating Taliban are becoming more vicious towards Afghans, particularly Afghan women. In the absence of a legal framework in Afghanistan, Taliban are interpreting Sharia law and it is based on their own understanding, and it leaves the situation that many people are open to prosecution and persecution, which is perfectly could be justified under the Taliban. I also call upon the international community that there is still a window of opportunity to ensure that Taliban are held to account, and the international community, particularly members of the UN Security Council, members of the European Union, and also other countries who are actively engaged in Afghanistan, they must do, I'm just giving a number of recommendations. Make sure you impose travel ban on all leaders of the Taliban, including Haqqani network. And that travel ban needs to include by air and by land to any country, including our neighboring countries. Impose penalties against countries who are violating United Nations sanction and resolution on travel ban of the Taliban. Because what we have seen even in the 1990s, when there was a travel ban, still Taliban leaders were traveling freely, particularly to Pakistan and some other neighboring countries. Stop sending cash to the Taliban. And that money is never used for the welfare of Afghans. And this money is always paid for the military, for the intelligence issues, which is directly connected to the mass human rights violations in Afghanistan that is happening right now in the country. Impose asset freeze on all assets and businesses of the Taliban leadership and ensure that this includes their assets in the Middle East and also in the neighboring countries. Channel all the humanitarian aid assistance to the Afghans through United Nations, international and local aid agencies, because we saw that in the past few months, giving cash to the Taliban under the name of the humanitarian assistance, it only empowered the group to continue with the mass human rights violations in Afghanistan, and many of that is against the European Union and also against the international humanitarian and human rights law. Ensure that women are not only significant part of the aid delivery, but also recipient of the aid, particularly in this situation when women are not allowed to work or travel without a male chaperone. urge UN to create an oversight mechanism for the equal and non-discriminatory distribution of aid to the people in need. What we saw, like for example, in the past few months, UN and other aid agencies, they have failed to provide support to the Afghans who were displaced as a result of the conflict by the Taliban. And that needs to stop, and you have the power to do that. Also, allocate adequate financial and political support to the Afghan Special Rapporteur, Mr. Richard Bennett, and his office, and strengthen his mandate and ability to independently monitor, report on the situation of human rights, including women's rights in Afghanistan. And also, the European Union must take serious actions against Pakistan for hosting, sponsoring, exporting terrorism to the region and to the wider world. Unfortunately, we as Afghans, we did not hear much actions against Pakistan, which is at the moment over a dozen of terror groups are being supported and harbored within that territory. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mosadiq. You have pictured, or actually shown us a quite grim picture of the situation of human rights activists in Afghanistan and the Taliban regime, especially the women over there. But I'm sure your recommendations have reached places where it should be, and His Excellency von Brandt will reply to them after everyone has spoken. Madam Mosadiq finished her speech with situation in neighboring countries and extremists in neighboring countries in Pakistan, and what the international community do.